I lay on the cold kitchen floor, helpless, pain shooting through every cell, while my own family laughed in the next room. No one came in, no one called out. Even the next morning, no one noticed that something had happened to me. And I realized one thing. If you're just a shadow to them, then your home is just a roof over their heads. But this was my home. And a month later, when they least expected it, I made them feel what it's like to be unwanted. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Marilyn Stewart. I was 66 years old when I finally admitted to myself that I had become invisible in my own home, not metaphorically, not poetically, but in the simplest, sharpest sense. A woman no longer seen, no longer heard, no longer considered. For nearly 30 years, I worked as a nurse in New Jersey, first at a busy city hospital in Jersey City, and later at a quiet, privately run clinic in Middletown, where the pace was slower, the faces more familiar. I saw births and deaths, stitched wounds and held hands. I stayed long hours, missed holidays, and swallowed grief more times than I could count. I was good at my job, reliable, empathetic, the kind of nurse people asked for by name. When I retired, I thought I would finally get to rest in the home I had built with my late husband, Greg. A modest single-story house with faded red shutters and a backyard filled with wild rosemary and marigolds. We had planted every shrub ourselves. He passed away 5 years before my retirement, a quiet, heart-wrenching departure that left the walls echoing with absence. I stayed, the house stayed. Then my son moved in. Jacob had lost his job, another startup that folded overnight, and asked if he, his wife Becky, and their 2 young children could stay just for a while. I said yes, of course. That's what mothers do. That's what I had always done. At first, I was hopeful. The house would have noise again. Life. I imagined helping with homework, sharing dinners, maybe even hearing thank you now and then. But it didn't take long for things to shift. They took the master bedroom. My room became the one closest to the laundry, small and windowless, where we used to keep holiday decorations. The kitchen slowly transformed. My mugs moved to a high shelf. My preferred tea brand disappeared from the pantry. I cooked less. They ordered food more. I tried to offer help with the children, but Becky preferred her parenting methods and gently, then firmly, shut me out. The days blurred. I would wake, make coffee, and sit at the kitchen table with the morning sun streaming through the window, waiting to be acknowledged. Sometimes they walked past me as if I were a coat rack. I heard them talk about their plans, vacations, home renovations, job interviews, none of which included me, not even by name. The grandchildren, once sweet and curious, began to mirror the indifference. No good morning, no good night. They weren't cruel. They were simply taught by silence. I was just there, furniture, a shadow that paid the property taxes and stayed out of the way. One afternoon, I found one of my old photo albums in the garage, half buried beneath boxes of toys and out-of-season clothes. Dust coated the cover. I flipped through the pages alone, staring at images of birthday cakes, Halloween costumes, beach trips. My smile, once constant, looked foreign now. I closed the album and tucked it under my arm. No one asked what I was carrying. Dinner time became the loudest reminder. They would eat in the living room, plates balanced on their laps, watching shows I didn't understand. I'd prepare my own small meals, soup, toast, the occasional salad, and eat them at the table, alone. I used to wait to be invited. I stopped waiting. No one noticed. I started walking more, around the neighborhood, past the library, down by the waterfront. Strangers would nod or smile. That sliver of acknowledgement meant more than I could say. Sometimes I'd sit on a bench and imagine packing a suitcase. I didn't know where I'd go, just somewhere else, anywhere that wasn't this place where I had become transparent. I began to write things down, not in a diary. I never liked those, but in a small leather notebook I found in the drawer of my nightstand. Lists of feelings, observations, reminders of who I used to be. Marilyn, the nurse who once ran entire shifts on 3 hours of sleep. Marilyn, who made the best lemon cake in the neighborhood. Marilyn, who used to dance barefoot on the patio with Greg. I didn't know what I was building with those words, but they anchored me. One morning, I watched as Becky walked past me with a stack of laundry. She didn't look up. Behind her, Jacob brushed crumbs from his hoodie, talking on the phone, laughing. I was sitting in plain sight, but I didn't exist. That was the morning I realized something had to change, not just around me, inside me. It was a Tuesday evening when everything shifted. The sky outside had begun to dim, a soft violet haze hanging over the rooftops. I had been reading in my room, my knees covered with the old crocheted blanket my mother made decades ago, when a familiar hunger stirred in my stomach. I hadn't eaten since lunch, and no one had asked if I wanted dinner. They never did. I moved slowly through the hallway, hearing the muffled sound of the television playing some reality show in the living room. The children were shouting and laughing over each other. Becky's voice rose above the chaos, telling someone to turn it down, but no one listened. I smiled faintly at the noise. Once I used to cherish that sound. Now it felt distant, like it belonged to a house down the street, not mine. I stepped into the kitchen, the linoleum cool beneath my bare feet. The fluorescent light above the stove flickered slightly, the way it always had. I reached into the cupboard for my teacup, stretching just a bit too far, and that's when it happened. A sharp pain seized my chest. Not unbearable at first, just a sudden deep ache that made me catch my breath. I tried to step back, but the floor shifted beneath me, or maybe it was me losing balance. My hand flailed toward the counter, but found only air. My knees buckled. My hips struck the edge of the cabinet, and then I was on the floor. The cold hit me first, then the pain. A radiating throb pulsed through my side and up my back. My head swam. I tried to call out, but the words didn't come out clearly. I lay there, frozen, waiting. Surely someone would come. I listened. Laughter. Laughter from the next room. The show must have reached a punch line. A door slammed. Someone ran across the hardwood floor above me. Then silence. Then the hum of the fridge. The light overhead buzzed faintly. No one came. I tried again, forcing sound from my throat. It came out as a croak, pathetic and small. I rested my head on the floor, cheek pressed to the cold tile, and stared at the baseboard near the refrigerator. Dust gathered there. I noticed a hairline crack in the paint. I fixated on it. Something to look at. Something to anchor me. Minutes passed. Or was it longer? I began to tremble, not just from pain, but from something deeper. A shame that boiled beneath the surface. Not because I had fallen, but because I had fallen and no one noticed. Eventually, I rolled onto my side. The pain stabbed, bright and sharp, but I pushed through it. I reached for the chair, pulled myself up inch by inch, gasping through clenched teeth. My hands gripped the table until the room stopped spinning. I stood in the kitchen, alone, my breathing ragged, my heart pounding not just from the fall, but from the realization I could have died right there. and nothing would have changed. No one would have checked. No one would have found me until maybe morning, and even then, not out of concern. Maybe they'd ask me to make coffee. I shuffled to my room like a ghost, one hand pressed against my ribs. The pain burned with each breath, but I didn't stop. I didn't want to cry. I didn't want them to see me weak, even if they hadn't seen me at all. That night, I didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling. I watched shadows shift across the walls. I listened to the sounds of the house, laughing, footsteps, the creak of floorboards, and wondered when exactly I had been erased. The next morning, Becky glanced at me over her phone and said I looked tired. I told her I had a headache. She nodded and went back to scrolling. They didn't see the bruises. They didn't ask about the way I held my side. They didn't notice that I didn't touch my breakfast or that I winced every time I moved. That day, I sat on the porch and watched the mail truck pass. The wind picked up and scattered the leaves across the lawn. I sat there for hours. I wasn't waiting for anything. I just needed to feel the air to remind myself that I was still here. Something had broken in me, not just ribs, not just bones. Trust, faith, the quiet belief that family would always be there, even when the world wasn't. It wasn't the fall that changed everything. It was what came after, or rather, what didn't. The days that followed were slow and muted, like moving underwater. Every sound felt distant, muffled by something I couldn't name. I didn't speak much, and no one noticed. I moved through the house like a shadow, present but irrelevant. I took longer to rise in the morning, careful not to strain the bruised side of my body. The pain still lingered, a dull throb that pulsed with each movement. But even that pain began to feel like company. At least it acknowledged my existence. The silence wasn't just around me, it had seeped inside. I stopped turning on the radio. I stopped humming to myself while cooking. I didn't bother calling friends. I had grown so used to shrinking myself that I feared even my voice might sound out of place. The house carried on, loud and full in places I didn't occupy. Becky continued her routines, always with that half-distracted air of someone juggling a dozen tabs on a screen. Jacob spent hours on calls, speaking in the clipped tone of someone who was always just about to close something big. The children's voices echoed through the hallway like static, sharp, constant, unavoidable. But none of it was meant for me. No one asked where I went when I left the room. No one noticed when I skipped meals. I began spending more time on the porch, wrapped in a thick cardigan, cradling a lukewarm cup of tea. I sat for hours, watching the same cars pass by, watching the leaves slowly die and fall and scatter. I memorized the patterns of the cracks in the sidewalk. I traced them with my eyes like fault lines. Once I sat through the entire afternoon without anyone checking in. Not a word, not a knock, nothing. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the sky bloomed into a quiet dusk. I stayed until it was dark enough that I couldn't see the chipped paint on the railing anymore. I started writing again, not in a diary, just small notes to myself, observations, sentences that felt heavy enough to anchor the emptiness. I wrote about the sound the floor made when I limped, about how the tea never stayed warm long enough, about the way I used to laugh so hard it hurt, and how I couldn't remember the last time I did. There was a photo in my drawer I kept coming back to. It was old, creased, a little faded. Greg and I standing in front of this very house, freshly painted, holding the keys like we had won the lottery. I looked at our faces, so open and alive. We had been so proud. This house was supposed to be our future. Now it felt like a cage with the bars disguised as walls. I didn't cry, not then. I had already done my crying in quieter, smaller ways. turning down the stove too quickly, walking away from a conversation I was never part of. The tears had dried up into silence, and yet, in that silence, something shifted. I began to see them differently. Not cruel, not monstrous, just careless, self absorbed. They hadn't noticed me because they had never really looked. I was convenience, a name on the deed, a placeholder. Their lives ran parallel to mine but never intersected, and in seeing that clearly, something inside me started to stir. A small ember of thought, a question that had no anger in it, just cold certainty. If I disappeared tomorrow, how long would it take for them to notice? I sat with that question, let it settle into my bones, not to make myself bitter, but to clarify the truth. I was tired of spinning stories in my head to explain their behavior, tired of giving the benefit of the doubt. The fall had changed something. The silence had solidified it. They had built a life in my house, a life that excluded me. So maybe it was time I started building mine. The idea had been growing quietly, like ivy curling through cracks in stone. At first, it was only a whisper at the edge of my mind, a wondering. Then, after the fall and the silence that followed, it began to take shape. A plan, not for revenge, but for reclamation. Not to punish, but to assert. I needed to take something back, something that had always been mine, the house. I had worked for it. Greg and I had paid every mortgage bill, painted every wall, repaired every leak. We had built our life inside these rooms, raised our child under its roof. It was never meant to become someone else's entitlement. It was never meant to be a resting place for those who couldn't be bothered to care for it, or for me. I pulled out the drawer in my bedroom and retrieved the manila folder. It was thick with paperwork, yellowed at the edges, but still meticulously organized. Deed documents, insurance, tax receipts, our names, mine and Greg's, typed over and over again in a formal font that once meant permanence. I flipped to the page I already knew by heart, the one that held the signature line beneath my name alone. When Greg passed, I had inherited full ownership. The house was mine. I studied that line, the sweep of my signature beside the inked stamp of the notary. No one else's name, no one else's right. They had moved into a home they never paid for, treated it like theirs, and slowly erased me from its center. But legally, structurally, in black and white, I was still the foundation. That realization lit a small flame inside me. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt focused. The next day, I called my attorney from the library, using their phone so mine wouldn't be overheard. It was a man I'd worked with years ago when Greg and I set up our wills. I wasn't even sure he would remember me. But when I explained who I was and what I needed, his voice sharpened with attention. I scheduled an appointment. I took the documents with me in a plain canvas tote. On the bus ride into town, I looked out the window and saw the streets of my youth. Shops that had changed hands, buildings that had once held meaning. I hadn't done this kind of thing in years, taking a step entirely for myself. At his office, I felt awkward at first, out of practice with formality. But once I explained the situation, how I lived with my son's family, how they treated me, how they assumed ownership without responsibility, he didn't blink. He showed me my options. He explained how property rights worked, how eviction procedures were handled, what protections I had under state law. I left his office not with rage, but with reassurance, with documents in hand and appointments set. There were steps to take, steps I now understood. That evening, while they laughed over takeout in the living room, I sat at the dining table and filled out forms. I signed with steady hands, the weight of each stroke pressing down with more certainty than the last. I made copies. I labeled folders. I tucked everything away in a locked drawer with the key hung on a chain I wore around my neck. They didn't notice, not when I printed forms, not when I took calls behind closed doors, not when I began asking more questions about utility bills, or when I stopped paying for certain subscriptions in my name. They were too busy, too distracted, too confident that I was nothing more than background. But I was preparing. It felt strange to be in motion again, to be carrying something secret, and yet it gave me clarity. I wasn't doing anything vindictive. I wasn't out for drama. I was simply drawing a boundary where none had existed. They had assumed I would never act, that I would remain passive, present only for their benefit. But they were wrong. For the first time in a long while, I felt like a woman with agency, with a name and a signature that meant something. I had lived too many days as a ghost in a home I owned. Now I would reclaim it, quietly, firmly, lawfully. They had mistaken silence for weakness, but the paper didn't lie, and neither did my name, spelled out in clear ink beside every signature line. It was a morning like most others, except something inside me had settled. A kind of decision had taken root, not in haste, not from spite, but from something quieter and deeper. The kitchen was still filled with the scent of someone else's breakfast when I walked through, unnoticed as always. My ribs still ached if I turned too quickly, a sharp reminder of how I had lain on that floor alone. But now, the pain didn't feel powerless. It felt like a turning point. I waited until the house emptied. Jacob had taken the kids to school, and Becky had gone to her part-time job at the boutique. The silence was sharp and clean. I brewed myself a cup of tea and set it beside the worn folder I had retrieved from my room. Inside that folder was my life in paper form, documents going back years, tax statements, mortgage receipts, the death certificate of my husband, Gregory, and the deed to the house. The original deed, creased at the corners, still had our names written in elegant cursive. But most important was the revised document, the one issued after his death. That one had only my name. I stared at it for a long time. I remembered the day we signed the papers, the notary's office smelling faintly of ink and stale coffee. I had dressed carefully that morning, still grieving, but focused. I had taken that appointment seriously, knowing I was securing something Greg and I had built from scratch. I hadn't thought about that day in years. The ink had long dried, but it was still binding. My signature, neat and confident, stared back at me. I ran my fingers over it, letting the past settle into the present. I wasn't being petty. I wasn't being dramatic. I was the legal owner of the house they had slowly tried to take from under me, not by force, but by neglect, by assumption, by erasure. It was time to remind everyone, gently and firmly, that the ground they walked on had my name under it. I called a real estate attorney first. I told her I needed a consultation, not for sale, but for protection. I wanted to know what my rights were if I decided to ask my family to leave. I didn't use the word eviction. I didn't have to. She understood. She told me what I needed to gather and what documents would be required should things become formal. I listened, took notes, and thanked her with a politeness I hadn't used in weeks. I called the county clerk's office after that. I verified that the deed was still active, still valid, still unchallenged. It was. No one had tried to transfer anything behind my back. That gave me a kind of strength I didn't expect. I wasn't too late. Then I made an appointment with the notary again. I wanted everything current, everything official. I brought the paperwork in a clean envelope, walked into the office with my head held high, and filled out the necessary forms with a steadiness that surprised even me. My hands didn't shake, my heart didn't flutter. I signed my name the same way I always had, but this time it felt different, like reclaiming something I had almost forgotten was mine. Afterward, I stopped by the print shop and made copies. I organized them into folders labeled with dates and categories, one for legal documents, one for utilities, one for banking. I created a new binder just for me, with clear plastic sleeves and dividers. I tucked it away in the locked drawer of my bedroom nightstand. At home, the usual chaos resumed around me. The kids fought over a remote. Jacob complained about bills. Becky left her shoes in the hallway again. But I moved through it all with a calm resolve. They still didn't notice anything had changed, but it had. Each signature I had placed that day was a step forward, not just on paper, but in my own quiet transformation. I had been dismissed, ignored, and stepped over in my own house, but my name still carried weight. My pen still had power. I wasn't invisible on the documents, even if I had become invisible to them. I didn't tell anyone what I had done. Not yet. I wasn't ready to confront them. Not until I had everything in place. But I smiled a little to myself that night as I watched the wind move through the trees outside the window. They thought I was fragile, forgettable, slow. They had no idea what I had signed and what was coming next. The days began to blur together after I filed the papers. January slipped quietly into February, and the world outside remained wrapped in pale sunlight and cold wind. Inside the house, things went on as if nothing had changed, but inside me, everything had. There was no announcement, no confrontation, only silence, intentional, heavy, restorative. Each morning I woke before anyone else. I brewed my coffee in the dark, wrapped myself in my old knitted shawl, and sat by the front window. The sun would creep up over the horizon, pushing shadows across the snow-dusted lawn. I watched the neighborhood come alive slowly. The same dog walker at 6:45, the same delivery truck at 8:15. There was comfort in the patterns I didn't have to participate in. I didn't speak unless spoken to. I didn't offer help, reminders, or the gentle suggestions I used to give. If they forgot something, they forgot it. If the laundry piled up, I let it pile. I moved through the house like a ghost with purpose. Not sad, not angry, just still. I focused on the small things I had once loved. I reorganized my sewing box. I dusted the spines of books I hadn't touched in years. I started journaling each day, just a page or two. I wrote not to process, but to remember. I wrote down who I used to be and how far I had drifted from her. I took long baths with lavender oil. I wore earrings again. I made lunch only for myself and ate it by the window, sometimes with classical music playing softly in the background. I was rebuilding myself in silence, brick by careful brick. No one noticed, not really. They were too consumed with their routines. Becky complained often about being tired. Jacob was glued to his laptop. The children raced through the house like small storms. There were moments I sat in the very same room with them, and none of them acknowledged me. It would have been unbearable a few months ago. Now I welcomed the detachment. The silence wasn't just passive, it was armor. It kept their noise from touching me. It gave me space to listen to my own thoughts for the first time in years. I didn't need their validation. I didn't crave their appreciation anymore. I only wanted to exist on my terms again. Some evenings, I took walks around the block alone. The air would sting my face, and the wind would make my eyes water, but it felt good to move. My joints protested at first, but they adjusted. There was a bench 2 streets over where I liked to rest. From there, I could see the tops of the houses against the fading sky. I watched the lights come on in windows and wondered about the people inside. I wondered if they too sat in silence by choice. I noticed small things in the quiet, like how the heater in the hallway clicked twice before it turned on, how the stairs creaked in a particular rhythm when someone was rushing, how the fridge motor hummed lower at night. These sounds were now my company, my witnesses. They didn't interrupt. They didn't need explanations. One afternoon, I found an old letter tucked between 2 recipe books. It was from my mother, written decades ago. The handwriting was neat, the words full of tenderness. She had written about finding strength in solitude, about how women so often lose themselves in the noise of others. I pressed the paper to my chest and closed my eyes. She had known. She had lived it too. That night, I made soup from scratch and lit a candle just for myself. I didn't ask if anyone else wanted dinner. They ordered takeout, and I didn't care. I sat at the table, ate slowly, and felt full, not just in body, but in spirit. A month passed like that. A month of rediscovering who I was beneath the obligations and assumptions. A month of not chasing affection. A month of being enough for myself. By the end of it, I had grown stronger, not in volume, but in clarity. I didn't need to shout to be heard. I only needed to act. The silence had done its work, and soon, so would I. It started like any other Sunday. The house smelled faintly of reheated leftovers, and the kids were yelling upstairs over some screen-related dispute. Becky was pacing around with a coffee cup in her hand, leaving trails of complaints behind her. Jacob had taken over the dining table again, hunched over his laptop as if solving the country's most pressing issues. I moved quietly as usual, invisible as ever. But something inside me was different. Today wasn't just another day. I knew it. I had prepared for it. The documents were already printed, signed, and neatly organized in my leather folder. The notary had stamped every page, and my lawyer had walked me through each paragraph twice. I didn't need to ask questions anymore. I didn't need reassurance. All I needed was the moment to come, and it did, sooner than I expected. Jacob had been reviewing bills when he suddenly turned to me with the same condescending tone he always used when pretending to include me. He wanted to know if I could cover the gas bill again, just this month. Something about unexpected expenses, about how tight things were with Becky not getting her bonus. His words washed over me like lukewarm water. They didn't sting, but they didn't touch me either. I just stood there, watching his mouth move, thinking about how I had let this routine go on far too long. When he was done talking, I didn't reply. I went upstairs, my folder in hand, and returned with it tucked against my side like something precious. I walked past him and placed it on the coffee table, then sat down on the couch, hands folded in my lap. He barely looked up at first, then did a double take when he noticed my posture, my expression, the stillness in the room. Becky emerged from the kitchen, annoyed by the quiet, and hovered by the doorway. I opened the folder slowly and pulled out the papers one by one, laying them flat in front of them. My name on the deed, the letter from my lawyer, the notarized notice, the final, non-negotiable decision. I watched as the realization crept into their eyes. Not fast, not dramatic, but like a slow, cold fog seeping through the cracks in their certainty. They skimmed, then read again. I didn't need to explain anything. Everything they needed to know was written there in black ink and crisp signatures. The house was mine. The utilities were being transferred. They had 30 days to find another place to live. And no, there would be no more conversations about what was fair or what they thought I owed them. The page spoke for me. My name, my power, was etched into every line. There was a long pause, not the kind that comes from shock, but from the absence of control. Becky looked at Jacob. Jacob looked at the papers. No one looked at me. I felt oddly serene. The silence that followed was louder than any argument they could have made. The rest of the day passed in pieces. I went back to my room and folded laundry. I made tea. I watched a documentary on nature and let my hands rest on the warmth of the cup. They didn't say much. They didn't slam doors or yell. Maybe they didn't know how to fight something so deliberate, so quiet. Maybe they were just beginning to understand that the woman they dismissed as fragile and slow had never been either. That night, I didn't sleep immediately. I lay in bed with the window cracked open, letting in the sound of wind moving through the trees. I thought about Greg and how we had built this house to be a home, not a hiding place. I thought about all the years I had spent giving and giving, shrinking myself to fit around others' needs. And then I thought about how good it felt to stretch again, to take up space, to own what was mine, not just in name, but in presence. By the time I drifted off, I didn't feel guilty. I didn't feel cruel. I felt clear. The truth wasn't loud. It didn't arrive with screaming or slamming doors. It arrived with paper, ink, and the quiet certainty of someone who had finally stopped waiting to be seen. The days that followed were marked by a strange quiet, not the kind I had known before, the kind that stung with exclusion or echoed with loneliness. This quiet was different. It was spacious, like the first breath after a storm has passed. It moved through the house in the form of decisions not needing to be explained, questions not requiring answers. I had said what needed to be said without using my voice. Now everything simply unfolded. Jacob avoided me. He no longer sat at the dining table with his laptop. Instead, he migrated to the bedroom, the kitchen counter, even the floor near the stairs, anywhere but in my line of sight. Becky became erratic, alternating between short-lived bursts of helpfulness and sulking silence. The children seemed confused at first, sensing the shift but not understanding it. They still asked me to help with their homework, still asked where things were. I answered, but briefly, gently, and without invitation for more. They didn't argue, they didn't confront me. They simply began to disappear piece by piece. Becky boxed up her craft supplies. Jacob canceled the gym membership that had been charging my account. I watched as they moved through the motions of undoing what they had once settled into with so much permanence. The house, which had once held their voices like wallpaper, now began to breathe again. I rearranged things slowly. I moved my favorite chair into the sunniest part of the living room. I returned the large potted plant from the back porch to the entryway. I dusted the old record player Greg and I had bought on our 20th anniversary and let soft jazz fill the corners of the house again. Nothing was loud, nothing abrupt, but the home was shifting, and this time it was shifting around me. Some days I took walks just to feel the cold air on my face, to remember that I was still a part of the world outside this house. Other times I stayed inside and wrote for hours. I started a letter to myself, then one to Greg, then one to the woman I had been before motherhood, before marriage, before all of this. Writing felt like reclaiming something lost in the folds of everyone else's needs. Their packing grew more determined by the third week. I overheard Jacob on the phone late at night discussing short-term leases. Becky began using her work printer to print out listings. I knew they were scrambling, but I also knew they had time. 30 days was more than generous. I had been more than generous. That thought used to bring me shame. Now it brought me pride. I spent more time in the garden, trimming back what had died over the winter and preparing space for new things to grow. The ground was still hard in places, but the frost was fading. Spring was weeks away, but I could already smell it in the air. The earth always seemed to know before we did when it was time to change. I cooked for myself again. I made meals that comforted me: simple stews, buttered toast, oatmeal with cinnamon. I didn't ask who wanted what. I didn't check for preferences. I had spent so long making dinners that pleased others, cutting my recipes in half or doubling them for guests who rarely said thank you. Now I cooked like someone who wanted to nourish herself. There were awkward exchanges, of course. Becky asked if I really wanted to go through with it. She said it was just a misunderstanding, that they hadn't meant to leave me alone. I listened. Then I nodded. Then I walked away. I didn't explain that it wasn't just about one night or one incident. It was about years of erosion, about a foundation that had been cracked in silence, a final collapse that had only revealed the truth already rotting beneath. In the evenings, I sat on the back porch with tea, watching the last rays of daylight slip behind the trees. It was still cold, but the light was longer now. I liked the way it reached for the edges of the yard, as if reclaiming territory. I understood that feeling. On the final Sunday before their departure, I stood in the hallway while they carried boxes down the stairs. I didn't offer to help. I didn't offer advice. I didn't feel spiteful or vindicated. Just solid. Just clear. I had done what I needed to do, and now life was adjusting to fit the new terms. After they left for the evening, I closed the front door slowly and leaned my back against it. The house was quiet again, but this time, the quiet belonged to me. The day they left for good came with no ceremony, no slammed doors, no last-minute apologies, no emotional goodbyes. Just the sound of cardboard boxes being lifted, the hollow thump of footsteps on the stairs, and eventually the faint sound of a car engine fading into the distance. I watched them from the upstairs window, not hidden, but not visible either. I stood behind the sheer curtain, still as the furniture, waiting until I could no longer see the tail lights. When the silence settled fully around me, it was like a deep sigh released from the walls themselves. The house exhaled. I could almost feel it relaxing with me, no longer bearing the weight of tension, resentment, and unspoken things. The floor didn't creak from restless pacing. The kitchen didn't echo with harsh voices. The living room didn't buzz with the glare of television. Everything was still, and for once, the stillness didn't feel like loneliness. That evening, I walked barefoot from room to room, reclaiming each one like a forgotten chapter. I touched the surfaces that had once felt foreign in my own home. I opened windows that had been shut too long. I opened the front door just to feel the air move through the hallway. The breeze brought in the scent of grass and pavement and cold, the kind of cold that wakes the skin rather than biting into it. The guest room became mine again. I took the linens from the dryer and made the bed with intention, smoothing every corner, fluffing every pillow. I dusted the nightstand and placed my favorite book beside a lamp with soft light. The mirror above the dresser had smudges, so I wiped them away until my reflection looked back at me clearly. I looked older, yes, but not small, not faded, not invisible. I looked like someone returning to herself. I made dinner late that night: roasted vegetables, lemon chicken, warm bread I had baked the day before. I set the table for one, but I didn't feel alone. I poured myself a glass of wine and lit a candle. I ate slowly, savoring the meal, the warmth of the food, the sound of a jazz record spinning softly in the background. Every bite felt like nourishment, not just for my body, but for something deeper. Afterward, I cleaned the kitchen without rush. The counters gleamed again. The sink emptied. There was a satisfaction in these simple movements, in the small claim of care for a space that belonged entirely to me. No one would leave dirty dishes for me to find in the morning. No one would question the groceries I bought or criticize the meals I made. The freedom in that quiet truth was staggering. In the days that followed, I began to fill the space again, but this time on my own terms. I took the curtains down and replaced them with linen ones that let the light pour in. I ordered a new rug in the color I loved, but had been told clashed with the furniture. I moved the coffee table to the side and left space in the middle of the room for nothing at all. Empty space, breathing room. I went through closets, drawers, boxes. I gave away what didn't feel like mine anymore. Clothes I wore out of obligation, decorations I never chose, books I never read. I made room for myself piece by piece, not all at once, not with urgency, but with quiet certainty. I sat outside more often. The porch became my favorite place again. I brought out a small table and chair, planted flowers in the railing boxes, and sipped coffee in the morning sun. I waved to neighbors I hadn't spoken to in years. I noticed the rhythm of the street, when the mail arrived, when the children walked home from school, when the air shifted just before dusk. Sometimes I caught myself smiling at nothing, just sitting in the stillness, surrounded by my things, my breath, my peace. The house didn't feel too big. It felt right. It had never been too much. It had only been too full of what didn't belong. I opened the drawer beside the bed and took out the folder one last time. I flipped through the documents again. My name on the deed, the lawyer's letter, the notarized signatures. I didn't need to see them, but I liked being reminded, not of the fight, but of the fact that I had won something, not just the house, but the right to choose how I lived in it. I placed the folder back in the drawer and turned out the light. That night, I slept with the window open and the covers tucked close. The air was cool and quiet. There were no voices echoing down the hallway, no sounds of doors shutting behind my back, just the soft ticking of the clock and the gentle rustle of wind through the trees. I was home, for the first time in a long time, completely, unmistakably home. And no one could take that from me again.